Hey all, so I asked ChatGPT to give me a good coding React interview question. Let's find out if I passed. So there are three main things I want to find out before the end of this video. The first one is what kind of questions are we going to get? The second is if we do get this on an interview, am I going to be able to solve this? Or do I suck at coding now? And number three is this actually a good React interview question? And, I'm going to give my thoughts and opinions about this one. So let's get to it. So the prompt that I put in is, what is a good React coding interview question? And here's ChatGPT's response. Write a simple tic-tac-toe game using React. The game should have the following features: a 3x3 grid, which represents the board, two players, an X and an O, the ability for a player to click on the grid to place their symbol, a reset button that allows you to play the game again, a display that shows which player's turn it is, and a display that shows the winner of the game, if any. So try to keep the code as simple and maintainable as possible. Then down below, it followed up with why this is a good question, and that's because it allows the interviewee to demonstrate their knowledge of React concepts, such as components, state, and props, as well as their ability to structure a simple application. All right, fair enough, and I can see why this might be a good question. So then I ask it, is this solvable within an hour, given that a coding interview typically happens within an hour? So it responds with, it's possible to solve this question in an hour, depending on the skill level of the interviewee. That makes sense. Relatively simple coding challenge that can be completed within an hour by an experienced React developer. So I think right now it's assuming that someone that has maybe 2-3 years experience with React, right, can quickly spin up components and be able to actually handle props and state with ease. It's with any coding challenge, it's important to give the interviewer enough time to complete the task while also providing enough of a challenge to assess their skills. So it may be helpful to adjust the difficulty of the question based on the level of the interviewee. Totally makes sense. And let's talk about that a little over at the end later on. All right, so then let's get to it and let's time me doing this coding interview. Okay, so I'm giving myself 45 minutes to solve this because I'd like to think that I can do this before the actual hour, given that I'm supposed to be more experienced. So the first thing I'm doing here was to copy paste the requirements or the checklist that ChatGPT gave us, and it's going to serve as a reference, sort of a to-do list of the things that I'm going to have to implement, in terms of component, code, logic, etc. Let's dissect the list that I have here. So first, I'm adding kind of like subtasks for myself. In a 3x3 grid, I need a component for the board, maybe a component for each cell. There's two players, right? One X and one O player. We will default by starting with player X, and the player will alternate, right? Every time player 1 moves, then it's player 2's turn, and so on and so forth. Then we need the ability for the player to click on the grid cell to place on their symbol. I put this as definitely, this is going to be an on-click event for me. We need a reset button, so a button component that does the resetting. Here, a display that shows the player's turn. Obviously, that's another component. And then there's a display that shows the winner of the game, if any, another component that will display the winner. So the goal here is that we have some reference that we can keep going back to as we code, just to check off that, hey, we've accomplished every single thing that we're supposed to do. This is really good to do on your interview before you start actually coding, because it, like I said, it serves as that reference, right? You're not going to forget something, or you're not going to mistake doing something that you're not supposed to do. The next thing I'm doing right here is that I know I need to create multiple components for the different parts of the UI. So I'm going to be creating component for the board, for the player's turn, which displays which player's turn is it, and the actual winner, which displays the winner if there's a winner that, after someone moves, right? If a winner does exist. So I started creating some boilerplate code for each of my components that you would see for the next few minutes here. I'm going to be creating files and components and going to try to display something like some sort of hello world just to see that my React is generating and rendering the components properly. So at this point, about 5 minutes in, I created the boilerplate or the skeleton of my application. So this is a good thing to do as opposed to focusing deeply on one component. Try to kind of make a skeleton of the application that you're doing. This allows you to kind of gather your thoughts and attack this problem from a high level, knowing what components you need to write and what kind of logic will be contained within each component. So the next thing is, I know that the board itself, the board component, will have obviously the most logic, right? This is going to be the most complicated thing in this application. So that's what I chose to tackle first, because this is going to be the meat of the application. Board contains a grid that displays the tic-tac-toe board. There's going to be events on it. And there's going to be a state that changes, right? So the first thing I did here was I wanted to render a board. So I'm creating divs to display the board, and I'm going to be styling them. As you can see, the board has shaped up by this point. I have a grid, a 3x3 grid, 9 cells. It now represents, a decent enough tic-tac-toe board that I can work with. So I'm going to keep it kind of simple like this, and then probably start working on the logic itself. The next thing is to tackle the other components and give them a little bit more style, not just some simple divs with text on it, but maybe at least an H1, right? Something that is displayed a little nicer on the board and something that's easy for the user to see. So after about around 10 minutes, I basically got this UI. It's decent enough that it can be used as a tic-tac-toe board, and it displays all the components that we want: the winner, the current player, and the board itself. And so it's time to kind of really work on some of the logic. So I constantly check my my checklist. As you can see here, I forgot to add a reset button, right? So I'm quickly adding that in the UI. I didn't make a different component for it because the reset button is going to be directly involved with the game board's state. So I wanted to be in the same component as the board. At least if I were to make subcomponents, the logic itself will reside within the board's main component so that I can easily manipulate the board state data that I'm planning to create later on. Okay, so now I'm starting to create the state and logic of my application. Obviously, we need to use useState. My plan is to represent the board with a 2D array, right? It's going to be a 3x3 grid. So an array with 3 arrays within it. Also, each array or subarray basically has 3 items in it. What I was thinking was, how do I represent if there's an X or an O or nothing in that array or in that space in the board? So what I did here was to use nulls. And this is going to be the default state, right? The default state of the board is that everything is null because there is no move, right? So when the component renders, nothing will be displayed. There's no X's or O's. It's just going to be all null. And my thinking is that if it's null, we just won't show anything to the UI. So that's what I'm doing right here. After that, the next thing to work on is to actually handle some of the events, like clicking a cell, right? We need to update the state of this board once a cell has been clicked. So I named that the doMove function, which will update the board state. It'd be really nice for you guys to always comment your code, right? Especially if the beginning of functions, it give a kind of like a little description on what it's supposed to do. And even within your functions, keep putting comments down. It doesn't have to be excessive, but just like a quick summary of what's the logic, within the next few lines, basically. As you can see, other things I put in the comments are kind of like my thoughts on what do I need within this function? What are its arguments? What are return values? What do I need to execute if I do need to execute something within that function? We do need to know the current player when we do a move, right? We need to know if it's the X player or the O player, which is player 1 or player 2. And we need to validate that the move is valid, meaning I'm not overriding a different cell, right, when I do my move. So the first thing I did here is that I need to pass in the current player as props, right? That data is going to come from my app.js or from my top level component, because that's where I'm going to store that. The next thing I'm doing here is that I'm going to pass in parameters to my function, because when we do a move, we need to know what the user clicked on, which cell. And so that's represented by a row and a column, which is the coordinates in our 2x2 array of what the user clicked on. So here I'm kind of contemplating now, thinking in my mind, okay, how do I validate that the move is valid? And I kind of stumbled upon, kind of a brain fart here. But then I figured that out real quick. And then the next thing is going to be, okay, what does it mean to actually do that move? So I opted for, in terms of my validation, I'm just going to alert if the move is invalid, meaning they clicked on a cell with already, an X or an O in it, then it's invalid. I just opted to, use the built-in alert, which, is fine for kind of error checking when you're doing something really quick like this. So now after validating that the move is valid, basically, we need to update the actual state. So what we need to do is first, we need to copy the board, right? So that we can change the board state. Otherwise, the state will not update if we just use the same exact board. So the quick way for me to copy that is to use this hack, the convert everything to string first, and then parse it back into an object. And that's because if you know, we need to do a deep copy of this array, right? It's not a one-dimensional array, it's a two-dimensional array. So if we only did a destructuring, for example, right, that's a pitfall that you might find bugs, because each array within the array are still references to the old one. So after checking for the current player, we obviously need to know if the current player is the first player or the second player. Here I opted that the current player will hold the value 1 or 2, representing player 1 and player 2. So I did a quick check of just if current player given to me is equal to the number 1. There's better ways to do this and without hard coding, but we'll see if we can fix that later. After that, we can see that now we need to actually set the board to the new board state. But there's other things that we have to do after doing a move. That is to check for win condition and then trigger that the player turn is over so that the next player can do their move, meaning that we toggle between player 1 and player 2. So here I am creating my next function that I need, which is to check if the game is done. And the main goal of this is to see if someone's already a winner after that move has been done, right? So here, the things that I'm thinking about is we're gonna need to check vertically, horizontally, and diagonally if someone won the game, right? Three X's or three O's in a row in these directions. One thing that I'm contemplating here is that do I check for the whole board? Meaning, every time I call is game done, am I checking anywhere on the board? Are there three X's or three O's that are in a row? Or should I just be checking that when I move, right? I just did the move. Do I just check the area surrounding, right? In terms of vertically, horizontally, and diagonally, the move that I just did, and did that complete a row, right? I think that's a simpler solution. So I ended up doing that. What that means is, for example, I did a move at row the 0 and column 1, right? That means that I only need to check the first row, which is row 0, the second column, which is column 1, to see if that's there's a 3 in a row in there. And then for the diagonally, I can always hard code to just checking the diagonals, right? If it's a row of X's or sorry, a string of X's or a string of O's, right? So here's how I ended up doing that in terms of figuring out if there's actually a winner. First, I created I need to check who the current player is, right? The one that just did the move. If it's player 1, I'm looking for 3 X's in a row. And if it's player 2, I'm looking for 3 O's in a row. And I represented those as strings because my idea was like, I'm going to create one string, which is the concatenation of all the cells, right, that I'm checking for. So for example, in my vertical check, I need to look at the board state at the given, I'm going to freeze the column, right? But the row is going to change, right? And so I'm going to create a string from that and then see if that's the same as my win condition. If it is, then there's a winner. And I'm going to do that for my column or vertical check, for my row check, and then for my diagonal check. So for my horizontal check right here, I did the quick hack because it's basically one array that we're checking, one whole array. I can just do a dot join on that array, right? So that each element basically gets concatenated to a string. By the way, this is safe right now to just kind of like concatenate each string, because even if we have null values, that null is going to get stringified. So let's say you have an X and then a null and then a 0, right? That's going to be a string that's X null, X null O and not 0. And so that's kind of the idea here. And so if we see that the checks that we're doing is the same as any win condition, we immediately return true because that signifies that the game is done, right? So our function returns a Boolean, right? It has one kind of goal, is to just check if the game is done, given a certain move, right? As you can see, we have 3 parameters here: the board state, the row move, and the call move. So for the diagonal checks, I basically did the same as the column check, right? I hard-coded kind of like the values of the diagonals of the grid, right? So going from the top left all the way to the bottom right, and then the top right all the way to the bottom left, and then just seeing if that's equivalent to the win condition. And then here, I was just cleaning up my code a little bit, knowing that I could just do call check could just hold true or false, right? Each of the check could already compare with the win condition, so that in the end, on line 46 that you can see here, I just return do any of these checks that I have return true, and that would mean that the game is done. So now that our is game done function is complete, I am now going back to my do move and going to basically utilize that function to check for a win condition. By the way, at this point, we have not tested any part of our code, right? So I'm waiting to basically have some sort of complete do move logic before I kind of test each one. Just kind of hoping that, all right, the things that I'm doing, the logic that I have on is game done, for example, is correct. And we'll see what happens once we basically have all the logic done for do move, and we can actually click on the cells. One thing I'm doing here is that I'm assuming that I have these functions. These functions right now, for example, set game done, or set next player, things like that, are passed to me as props. Okay, that's why I'm putting a comment here that this will be a prop, because that data or that state will come from a higher level component, which is app.js. It's going to hold those types of data because it needs to be shared with the other components, right? The winner component and the current player component. So I need to be able to manipulate that. So I'm passing in those functions down as props to my board component. Now it's time for us to actually remove our hard-coded HTML and create the board by using the board state. Meaning we have to map over the 2D array and create each cell based on what's the state of the board game. So that's what I'm doing here. Down in the return, in my component, I'm mapping over the board, mapping over each row and each column, and regenerating the row and the cell of each of our board, basically. I actually had a little issue at this point in time. As you can see, there's red squiggly lines. I wasn't sure what it was, so I basically was trying to just read what it's telling me. And so looking back at kind of, okay, what is my board? Why is it not working? And then realizing that basically I've not actually used the use state, right? I created basically just a variable. And then I didn't even use state. So after putting that and putting that in my variable in the board, then my grid basically rendered as it should be. The next logic I'm adding here is what do we actually need to do for each cell? Remember, it could be null, X, or 0. So what I'm doing here is I'm checking for a null value, right? If the column is null, the cell is null, then we have to display nothing. Otherwise, we have to display the value in that cell. Okay, so at this point, about 10 minutes in, I realized that there's only 10 minutes left, but I was able to actually have my board represented. And right now I'm kind of like testing it a little bit to see if there are now X's and O's in my actual board, does it actually render in the way that I wanted? And as you can see, it does render, right? I manually updated the state over there with some values other than null, and it showed in my board. The next thing I'm trying to do here is we actually have to attach our click event, right, on the div, right? We have to actually be able to do our move. So I'm just kind of like formatting my code here so it's cleaner and I can now attach the onClick event. So what do we actually have to do? One thing I'm adding here are access to the index or indices, right? Where I am in the 2D array, because our do move takes in two parameters, the row and the column, because those are things that we would need in order to execute the function properly. You can see I have a quick error there, which is we need a key prop, of course, something that people tend to forget, even me, whenever you're looping through collection. So now it's actually time for us to do some testing and seeing if our do move function works. So first things first is that our props was not actually we never passed any props to this component, right? In app.js, we never modified it. We've been in board.js for a good while now. So what I'm doing here is just giving it default values, meaning because we haven't passed those props down, those functions, I'm just giving it an empty function. So the default value for those props are empty functions, and those it will allow me to test my code if the board state gets updated. So you can see here, I was able to finally update the board state. There's O's displaying, and what's the reason for that? Because the current player does not actually exist, right? So current player is not one, it's null, so it's going to true or else case. So it's always O that shows up. So it was time for me to actually pass in the proper props and have proper state in app.js. So that's the next step. As you can see, there's two main states that we need to create here. First is the current player. This allows us to trigger which player's turn it is in our board, and then we need to know if the game is done, because when the game is done, we need to show the winner component, right? That a player has won. As you can see here, again, I'm just hard coding the values 1 and 2 to represent player 1 and player 2. And I created a function called toggle player to kind of toggle be able to toggle the player between the X and the O player. Now it's time to pass those actual things to our board component so that our board can run properly. We also start passing in other props to our other components. For example, the player turn needs to know the current player so that it can display which player it is. And then we have the player winner knowing if the game is done and which player won, right? So we need two information: if the game's done and the current player. Here I was a little looking at the time. We have like 2.5 minutes left, so I was a little panicking. We're kind of close to being done, but we haven't really tested much of our board, even though we think it might be working properly. And as a side note, one thing that you have to get used to, by the way, is writing code from scratch, right? Without the assistance of an IDE to kind of create files or autocomplete for you, even though this does have some assistance, because you don't know what kind of system or machine or IDE you would code on in a coding interview. So that's why I'm also kind of like having a lot of typos here. I don't use this sandbox as much as I should be doing. So I'm tripping up in kind of some of the autocomplete. Okay, so at this point we were able to hide and show the game done. And then right now you can see that I'm able to switch and toggle the current player as I click through the board. The problem right now that I'm facing is there's a bug, right? Even though the current player toggles, it's only displaying O's and not X's. So why is that? So that's kind of like the thing that I'm chasing down here. And that's because I never actually passed current player as a prop to my component. So I went back to app.js, passed that down as a component, realized time is over, right? So that's 45 minutes. And I actually did not get to finish the challenge. So what I'm going to do here is, because I'm too invested, I'm going to give myself another 5 minutes and see if, in 50 minutes, I can actually solve and finish this problem. So that's what I did here. I was messing around with my slider for my timer and gave myself another 5 minutes to continue working on this. As you can see, at this point, I've actually been able to toggle between my players now. The board displays X's and O's. The current problem, however, is now I made an actual win condition at 3 X's in a row diagonally, but it's not showing me that the game is done, right? My game done component is not showing a winner appear, and it's not telling me the player. So I realized that my set game done, when I'm calling it, right, I never pass in a true or false, right? So by default, the state is false, but in here in my code on do move, when the game is done, I never set it to true. So that's what I did. I added that, and that was my bug. That's why, guys, it's super important. Always check your code, right? One thing also, that a function that we never created, is that we have to reset the board, right? So that was the next thing that I'm doing here, is that we have to have a way to reset the board, because there's a reset button and it doesn't do anything right now. So what I did here was I created a default board variable to kind of use as a default state, so I could always reset to that state. Meaning, when the reset button is clicked, I could just say, hey, set the board to this default state. So in my reset function, I know I have to do more than reset the board. So I wrote down all the things that I have to go and reset. So the board, the player, and the winner has to be reset, right? So in case the game is over, there is an actual winner. So we need to make sure to revert the game back to it being not done again. And then we have to set the current player back to 1, or player 1. So that's one thing that I added here in my props. I needed to be able to change the current player. So I added that as props to my board component. And oopsie, I never actually attached the reset function to my reset button. So that's what I'm doing here right now. Awesome. The board actually resets every time I click the reset. As you can see, it reverts back to the current player being 1. And when there is a winner, it removes that kind of winner announcement, right? So here I'm going back to my checklist, trying to see, okay, did I go over everything and have implemented everything, right? So I have 30 seconds left on the clock. What I'm trying to do now is check, kind of like do a lot more testing. Specifically, where is the meat of my logic? That's in checking for moves and wins. And here's one area where I saw a bug. I have 3 O's in a row, and current or player 2 should have won, but it didn't announce it. It just toggled the player. So here, I was kind of like, okay, we have 6 seconds left again, and we're not done. We have to debug this. So what I'm going to do is reset the timer again, give myself another 5 minutes, and hopefully be done. Technically, we had some padding. We only gave ourselves 45 minutes in an hour-long interview, even though that's how long it should just be. So we're going to see if within this next 5 minutes, we can actually hash out and figure out our bug. So what I'm doing here, the strategy I'm doing here, is just console logging, right? I have a bunch of data that I expected them to be one in holding a specific value given a specific board state, right? So I'm trying to trigger that kind of the steps for that bug, right? And as you can see here, for example, in my log, it says the win condition is false, or the equality between win condition and what I'm trying to compare is false. And that's when I realize the bug, that I am using 0 instead of the letter O. All right. So that's one way why you shouldn't hard code values, but rather create constants and use those constant variables, so that you can keep referring to those variables rather than keep using either zeros or x's, right? The problem with my code was that, so now you can see it was working with that condition, but the problem with my code was that I'm comparing zeros with O's, and though it might look the same to the naked eye, to our eyes, obviously the computer knows that that's not equal at all. And so here I'm just doing more testing, horizontal, vertical, player 1, player 2, diagonal, going back to kind of each checklist, each item in my going back to each item in my checklist. And since I think I'm done, I've kind of proved my work and that the logic works, I just went ahead and added some styling. Given that I had extra minutes on that extra 5 minutes that I gave myself to make the board just a little nicer. And really, it's just making the X's and O's a little bigger. And so I kind of just stopped there because, yeah, I think at this point I've done the coding challenge. All right, so now that we're done with the actual coding part, let's see how we did in terms of timing. We gave ourselves, or I gave myself about 45 minutes to do this coding challenge, which obviously the time expired. I had a bug towards the end, around 2 minutes left with the O's versus zeros. And then I fixed that, and we added 5 minutes for that, and then I added another 5 minutes just because I wasn't satisfied in terms of testing the actual functionality of checking if the game's done, right? So I tried diagonal, vertical, horizontal, and all that stuff, which took another 2.5 minutes. So in the end, our total timing was around 52 minutes. How do I feel about that? I think it's okay. I do think that this is a bit of more involved coding challenge for something that takes place on maybe a coding interview that would take in an hour. I do think an hour is a good time for this, but the interview part itself should be maybe an hour and 20 minutes to give a chance for, some extra stuff. But before that, let's say we did have an hour to do this. 52 minutes, so I have 8 minutes left. What would I change? What are the improvements I can do to the code that I just wrote, right? So first things first, probably I would focus on the code itself, right? If I had like another 8 minutes, I would test more aspects of it, right? So one thing that I just noticed, right, is with the game done, what happens when all the boxes are filled out? Let's quickly check, right? So let's say no one wins. Make sure I don't win right there, right? It's a tie. We don't have a state or some sort of way to tell that, hey, there's no winner, right? So I would add that. Another thing is just to make the code better and less bug proof, I would clean it up in terms of, for example, we had problems with constants like this. I would move them into a constants file, an actual place where I don't hard code strings and I don't hard code like the number one for setting the current player to one. So things like that. And then if I've done all of those and I still have time, then that's when I'll work with aesthetics, making the X more centered in the middle of everything and bigger. The reset button, styling it a little better, right? But so yeah, that's pretty much it for this challenge. All right, so now let's flip the table and say that I'm the interviewer giving this problem at an interview, right? How would I evaluate the candidate based on kind of this code that they wrote, right? So given that it's a React technical interview, obviously I would look for kind of how well are they at React in general. So going over kind of React best practices and see if that was implemented in this solution, right? So the first thing I would check is, given this challenge, how did they create their components, right? And how did they manage to contain logic within each component? So for example, I break down components by having, based on kind of like the display, I know I need to show the current player's turn, the current winner, and then I have a board, right? Did the candidate just basically write all their logic in app.js? That's a bad sign if, you're supposed to really use components to kind of isolate logical pieces of code, right? The next thing I would look for is kind of data, right? How did they handle their data? Is, again, all the data in app.js, or they make use of state and props properly? And how did that data became shared across the whole app? As you can see, this is a pretty simple app, and we didn't need to use something more complex that's required outside of just using props and state. So that's the second thing. The third thing I would do is use of hooks. Use state, right? That's the only hook we got to use in this one. But if I were to ask a question, I'd probably involve some kind of other things that allow for a different, more hooks in general, right? And obviously you could optimize this code as well with the use of other hooks, but for something that's meant to be written within an hour, it's usually the simplest code that achieves the goal is all that's needed. And then their general comfortability with React, right? How well did they write their React in terms of like, are they stumbling on where to put functions or how to, even import use state? Like, do they get used to kind of like templates from their IDE that they forgot to like import React, for example, stuff like that. The way they return the divs and organize the divs, or even kind of here, kind of like how would you represent the board state, given that the board state's coming from a two-dimensional array, right? And then after kind of all that React related things, I would look for general coding and organization, right? How did they write their code? Is it clean? Are there a lot of hard coding? Obviously, I talked about, moving things into constant so that I don't have to hard code them, right? It's sometimes, you don't enough to mention that, hey, I know that this is not that clean, right? If I had more time, I'm going to clean stuff up. Yeah, and kind of like how did they write their functions? There's meaningful logic behind kind of each function, and their ability to debug, right? That's the next thing. I kind of got a problem with checking my is game done, right? So the bugs are always going to come out on your what when you code, especially on an interview. You're under pressure, right? So, and you're writing a lot of code. At least here on this challenge, we wrote board.js, which is the most code, is about 100 lines. There's meant to be bugs. So how do you handle those bugs, right? And obviously, after that, bugs come out when you're testing, right? So did the user do proper testing of the actual challenge, of the actual code that they wrote, right? And then the next thing after that, the only thing probably to look for is the UI. Like, how comfortable are they when they were writing their HTML and CSS styling? Did they at least give some effort into having a decent looking tic-tac-toe grid or board and displaying, who the current player is, and the winner? Did they, put some kind of thought into the logic? For example, what I did here is only display player winner if obviously there's a winner. So things like that. Yeah, so that's what I would look for when I gave this interview to a candidate, and it's a React centered interview. Okay, so for some final thoughts, am I actually going to use this question in a coding interview? No. And here's why. First, I do think that this question is just too long, both in terms of time it takes and the amount of lines of code. We had to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript/React, right? As you can see, the application basically had over 100 lines of code. And that's a lot of code to write. And I'd like to think that I do write decently clean code for an interview. The next thing is I don't think it's definitely doable within like 45 minutes. We did accomplish this around 50 minutes, but in an actual interview within the hour, there's a lot more question that goes on in terms of intros and knowing some other stuff about the candidate. So the coding interview part should be around 40 minutes, and this is going to be hard to fit in that 40 minutes. Number two, it involves creating a not so simple UI. As you can see, we had to represent some kind of a game state, the grid with X's and O's, and had to attach logic to that game state. Now, probably just creating that would be good, but then we had to display current player and all these other stuff. So there's just, again, coming back to it's a little bit too big for an hour long interview. Number three, depending on the engineering level, if you're a junior developer, I think that this is simply just too long. I think it's simple enough that you should be able to do the logic, but there's just simply too much code going on. And then for a senior level engineer that I'm looking for, I think it's too simple. There's just props and state and handling events. I want to be able to see if this person can use other hooks like use effect, use context, how they manipulate data on, a more larger scale of application. But I do think that this is a good basis for a interview question. Things that I would do to modify this is, for example, a candidate is going on site for a day long interview. I would split this into two parts. The first is I would kind of give them a mock UI of a tic tac toe board and tell them to replicate that. And that would give me a good reading on their HTML and CSS, proficiency. And then the next part would be the React part of applying the logic to that UI. And so in that way, they actually have over an hour technically in terms of coding the whole thing, and you can probably add a little more features to it if you desire. Another way I would give this as an interview question or challenge is as a take-home assignment. Some companies have started doing this where they give you a take-home assignment and they make you submit a bunch of code that's part of your actual on-site interview, or maybe it's kind of like to screen you, but basically it's supposed to take like 4 hours to do. But this is a good candidate for that, right? Add more features to it, not just the simple thing that we did here, but something that could take a candidate maybe 2-3 hours to do, and then see how they create an application given that amount of time, how they organize their thoughts, their code, their logic, how clean they are at writing code. So that pretty much rounds up all of my thoughts about this one. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of this interview question, and is this something that you would be able to do if you were given this in an interview? And yeah, see you later.